This video is brought to you by Nebula. On Tuesday, the White House published a document detailing Trump's new America First trade policy. As well as all the usual stuff about tariffs and trade deals, lower down the document there was a relatively short clause that mandated the Secretary of the Treasury to investigate whether any foreign country subjects United States citizens or corporations to discriminatory or extraterritorial taxes pursuant to Section 891 of the US Tax Code. Now, this might sound technical or unimportant, but Section 891 is a pretty crazy law. It gives the president the power to, without congressional approval, double taxes on all citizens and businesses of a foreign country if that country is apparently discriminating against US citizens or businesses in its tax policies. So in this video, we're going to look at what exactly Section 891 does, who Trump has in his sights, hint, it's the EU's big tech regulations, and the OECD's global minimum corporate tax rate, and whether it'll actually work. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our new podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's start with a bit of context. Section 891 was passed into law way back in 1934, mainly because the US thought that the French tax system was discriminating against American companies. In short, France taxed dividends from both American companies and their French subsidiaries, and the Americans said this was double taxation, and thus unfair. To be fair to the Americans here, the French tax system at the time had a law preventing the same thing happening to French companies, i.e. French companies weren't taxed on dividends arising out of income received via the dividends of their subsidiaries. To this end, in April 1932, the two sides agreed a new tax treaty that was supposed to do away with this wrinkle. But while the US promptly ratified it a few months later in June, the French dragged their heels a bit, and when the Americans got impatient, they passed Section 891 to essentially threaten the French into implementing the treaty they'd agreed. This apparently worked. Section 891 came into force in May 1934, and less than a year later, France had ratified the treaty without Section 891 ever being used. It sat on the statute books gathering dust until, well, really the 2010s, when the US became concerned that European efforts to tax big tech companies were, in effect, discriminating against American companies. In 2016, for instance, there was some talk of the US resorting to Section 891 to retaliate against the EU after the bloc ordered Apple to pay up to $14.5 billion in back taxes to Ireland, and Obama's Treasury Secretary Jack Lew accused the European Commission of being, quote, highly focused on US companies. Then, in 2019, senior members of the Senate Finance Committee recommended the US use Section 891 to retaliate against France after Macron's government adopted a new digital services tax levied on digital companies, and justified on the grounds that, at least according to the calculations by both the French and the EU, digital companies generally pay an average tax rate roughly 14 points lower than your average European SME. There was a similar furore after Canada implemented a similar tax last year, which applies a 3% tax on revenue generated from digital services provided to Canadian users by large companies, defined as those companies with global revenues of 750 million euros or more and at least 20 million Canadian dollars in Canadian digital services revenue. That it should hit the headlines once again shouldn't come as much of a surprise, given the spate of fines the EU has recently levied on big tech companies. Although it should be said that these fines aren't taxes like the French and Canadian laws, but rather antitrust penalties for companies that allegedly abuse their monopoly power to the detriment of European consumers. Most of these fines are levied under the Digital Markets Act, which requires large popular services such as search engines, social networks and chat apps to ensure a level playing field for their rivals, with violations of the Act inviting fines amounting to as much as 10% of a company's global annual turnover. Trump and Musk will also be anxious about the prospect of new moderation requirements for social media platforms like X, which seem increasingly likely given the ongoing frictions between Musk and various European leaders. Of course, Europe and Canada would resist the idea that their rules discriminate against any particular nation, After all, it's not like these regulations specifically reference any country. And while it's true they mostly end up applying to American companies, that's because America has all the big tech companies who fall within their remit. And frankly, the EU would love some companies big enough to fine. It's also worth noting, of course, that foreign companies regularly have to pay fines for breaking American rules. You might remember that Volkswagen ended up having to pay the US something like $15 billion for violating its emission rules back in the mid-2010s, and that the Europeans think that American companies are currently getting preferential treatment themselves, thanks to the US's protectionist tariffs and subsidies. Nonetheless, this has all become a bit of an issue to both American politicians, who see these fines and taxes as an infringement on American sovereignty and a way of Europe stealing American tax revenues, and American tech CEOs like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, who, well, presumably just don't like paying taxes or fines and now appear to have Trump's ear. The plan here seems to be to deter Europe, Canada, or any other country from regulating or taxing these big tech companies by threatening double taxes on any business their citizens or companies do in the US. There's also some speculation that Trump is going to use similar threats to torpedo the OECD's global minimum corporate tax deal. In a separate policy memo, Trump withdrew US support from the Global Tax Pact, but doing this by itself would be silly, because under the current terms of the deal, if one country charges less than the 15% minimum corporate tax rate, which is presumably what Trump wants to do, then the other countries in the pact, which now include basically every developed country in the world, can issue top-up taxes, which mean the corporation still ends up paying as much tax, but the US loses out on the revenues. However, if Trump can force other countries to withdraw by threatening them with Section 891, he could torpedo the deal altogether, allowing him to set whatever tax rate he wants. Anyway, if either of these things were to happen, if Trump were to weaponize Section 891 against either the EU or the OECD, it would represent a dramatic escalation on Trump's assault on the global economic order. Previously, Trump had been squarely focused on trade imbalances, which is why he was so keen on tariffs. He saw them mainly as a way to reduce America's ballooning trade deficit, especially vis-à-vis China. While Trump's focus on tariffs provoked some upset, there's a relatively wide consensus in macroeconomic circles that the global economy is indeed too imbalanced, and the criticism was mainly because people thought the tariffs wouldn't work, not because they rejected the premise. On top of that, there was a measurable goal here. If the American trade deficit fell to zero and the Chinese surplus did the same, Trump could say he was finished. Interfering in other countries' regulatory regimes, however, on somewhat spurious grounds, and apparently on behalf of your billionaire CEO mates, is going to be more controversial, in part because there's no clear endpoint. Trump wants other regulatory regimes to be fair to American companies, in inverted commas, but it's not clear how far other countries will have to go before he's satisfied. Like a lot of things, this whole situation is very much in a state of flux. With us entering a new year and Trump re-entering the White House, well, the world has felt more stable, hasn't it? Every day we're faced with weird headlines, from Trump's attempts to take over Canada and Elon's wild ride in Europe, or even Trump trying to swap New Jersey for a shiny Charizard on the playground. Okay, that last one might not be real, but we do dive into the chaotic world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our series where we explain everything that's happened across the pond in the land of the free. Because while the election might be over, with Trump in the Oval Office, the number of WTF moments only looks likely to increase. Unlike some of our other more serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more light-hearted, and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. If you're interested, WTF can be found exclusively on Nebula. Now, if you didn't know, Nebula is an independent, creator-owned streaming platform that specializes in thoughtful content. Over there, you can find creators like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, and Legal Eagle, with many of them releasing their very own original series on the platform. We're super proud of WTF USA, and we hope that with your support, we'll be able to make other interesting, weird, and entertaining series with Nebula in the future. So signing up genuinely helps TLDR to grow and expand. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click our link in the description to get 40% off. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.